Welcome back. We are about to begin now our lesson 8, which is a few centuries after the last lesson when we studied the life of the Germanic tribes, and then we studied Charlemagne. And we ended last lesson with the fall or collapse of the Empire of Charlemagne, and this was in the about 9th century. So by that time, the Middle Ages are the period happening in Western Europe, and we call it later, when we talk about the Renaissance and the Renaissance development of the idea of history, then we are going to understand why this period is called the Middle Ages. But for now, I wanted just to give you an idea of what historians even today call Middle Ages. The period itself is about 1,000 years, and it's about from the fall of the Roman Empire of the West in the 5th century to the Renaissance in the 15th century. So it's about 1,000 years. And because 1,000 years is so long, and the life of a group of people change so much in 1,000 years, even in 200 years, life changes tremendously. So historians divide the study of the Middle Ages in 3 periods. And I wanted to start this lesson giving you an idea of what we are talking about when we say early Middle Ages or when we say the High Middle Ages. So let's look at it for just a second before we even start with the lesson. So, Middle Ages, the timeline. First, early Middle Ages, and that's about when the time the Roman Empire fell to maybe a century or so after Charlemagne. And the reason why this is called the early Middle Ages is because even though Charlemagne made such a big difference in the cultural and even social life of the people, the 100 years after Charlemagne were again years of constant warfare. So what Charlemagne tried to do did not take place until maybe a century later. So that's why we still consider the century after Charlemagne part of the early Middle Ages. And that's, as I said before, maybe is when historians tend to say, oh, this is the Dark Ages. This is an obsolete term. Most historians do not use that anymore. So let's stay then with early Middle Ages. And this lesson is going to start with maybe the last part of the early Middle Ages, maybe the 9th or 10th centuries. And then the High Middle Ages, the next period, is about maybe 200 years, from the 11th to the 13th century, mid-11th to mid-13th centuries. And that is really the best period of the Middle Ages. That's when we talk about advances, when we talk about education, when we talk about literature, anything that we talk about that developed, and even the lifestyle itself happened during the High Middle Ages, is when things have settled, the invasions have ended, foreign invasions have ended, and the life has become more or less stable. Of course, it continues to change, but we could kind of explain generalities of the life of the High Middle Ages until about the end of the 13th century. And then comes the period that is about 100 years, that is called the Late Middle Ages. We are not going to talk about the Late Middle Ages in detail. We are going to mention that only, but it is the worst century maybe the 20th century in the world was as bad as the 14th century. It seems that all what could be wrong went wrong. All the bad things happened. Wars, famine, epidemics, economic disasters, everything that could go wrong went wrong in the late Middle Ages. And that's the period of the Black Death, and that ends the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance comes right after. And so the Renaissance will be the topic of a later lesson. So I hope this is more or less clear, and this explains when we talk about the early Middle Ages, you know about what we are talking about. When we say high Middle Ages, also you know it's between 11th and 13th centuries. Usually it's 12th and 13th century when historians say high Middle Ages. And then also I wanted to clarify the groups that existed in the Middle Ages. For instance, the leading group of society, the group that the leaders, the kings and queens, the lords, the ones who made the serious decisions on what to do, are the members of the nobility. And those in general, for you to remember it is easier, those are the ones who fight. So that is the group that controls society by fighting. So those are those who fight, the nobility. And then the next group is those who work, and those are the peasants. So those are the ones who work the land, and of course that's the majority of the population. Now something important is that there is no upper mobility during this time. So if you are born a peasant, you continue to be a peasant. If you are born into the nobility, even if you are in the lower level of the nobility, if you are a simple knight, if you don't have any other title, nevertheless you are a member of the nobility, therefore you can aspire to go up a little bit. But if you are a peasant, you will always be a peasant, and your children will always be peasants. And then the other group, which today we don't even think about, but that group was very important in the Middle Ages, is the group of those who pray. And those were the monks and priests, and they did have a very significant role in society. So basically those are the three social groups that for long time, for centuries, were the only ones that existed. Now I have to add one more, and I didn't write it down because this group is like a newcomer. They started in the high Middle Ages, but they became, of course, very important. And that group doesn't belong to the nobility, doesn't belong to the peasants, and they are not monks or priests. And they are the new class of merchants or craft people, artisans they are called, and they lived in the towns. But those are like the newer development. So for centuries and centuries, these were the three groups that existed in the Middle Ages. Okay, so I hope this is clear, and this explains, when you read your textbook and when you read the lesson, you'll understand what each group is and what is the role that each group played in the life of the Middle Ages. So let's then, I'm just going to explain in general what life in the Middle Ages is, and I would like to tell you that there are two terms that are the key terms of this lesson, and those terms you cannot separate one from the other. So these terms are used to explain the different aspects of the life during this time. And these terms, one of them is manorialism, manorialism, based on a manor, and the other one is feudalism. And the way to remember, even though I have a fat cat here who is hungry, so you have to, if you hear more meows, you know what it is. Okay, so when you hear the term manorialism, remember that manorialism is happening at the same time as feudalism is happening. So feudalism and manorialism are the same lifestyle. The only difference in the usage of the terms is when you refer to the economic aspects of the Middle Ages, you say manorialism. And when you talk about the political or social aspect of the Middle Ages, you say feudalism. So that's the main difference of those two terms. And in general, we could say that life in the Middle Ages is a life based on this: cooperation and obligations. So each group has certain obligations and is going to contribute to the life of another group. And that's how the relationships are going to happen. So there is no group that is isolated from the other. All the groups have certain rights and certain duties. And as long as all the people follow and fulfill their obligations, then they deserve to have other people give them their rights. And so that's really the summary of medieval life. So the next part of the lesson, this is what we just said is very important, because as you start reading and studying this lesson, you are going to start looking at what feudalism is, what are the obligations of those who participate in feudalism. So the one thing I want you to really be clear about is, when you say feudalism, the only group involved in feudalism is the upper class, which is called the nobility or aristocracy. And of course the upper level of the nobility or aristocracy is royalty. So the kings or queens are the upper level, and then comes the next level, and they are all the members of the nobility. In order to be a member of the nobility, you need to be a knight. So the definition of a member of the nobility is you have to be a knight. And there are several different levels in the nobility. So when you read about it, just read about the different obligations and the relationships that exist among the members of the nobility. And then part of the lesson is how a member of the nobility lives. So what is the life of a person who is a member of the nobility? And you are going to study the life of men, members of the nobility who are men, and you are going to study the life of the members of the nobility who are women, and what lifestyle they have, what obligations they have, and what is what they are expected to do during their life. And so this is the fascinating part of this lesson, which is to learn how the people, the real people lived. We are not talking only about the kings or the queens, we are talking about every level of the nobility. So what is what those women spent their day doing? What was expected of them? And the same with those men. What is what they are supposed to be doing? Are they expected to be educated? Are they expected to be strong? Are they expected to be nice and sweet? So all those things is what you are going to study and learn in this part of the lesson. And then once you do that, then the next section of the lesson is the other aspect of the life in the Middle Ages, which is manorialism. And we are going to then talk about the life of the peasants. So the manorial system is basically how those peasants who work the land lived, what kind of obligations they had toward the owners of the land, toward the lords, what kind of rights, if any, they had. Did they have any right to demand something from the lord or the lady of the castle? So all those things is what you are going to be studying. What is what they do every day? How do they spend their holidays? Is the work of women similar to the work of men? So all those issues are part of this lesson. And then once you study the life of the nobility and the life of the peasants, be sure and also look at the life of that new group that started very slowly. Some of the people who went to live in the new towns had been originally peasants, but they had some kind of talent. They were perhaps carpenters, stonemasons, and they did that as a side work, as an extra work apart from working the land, and eventually they went to live in a town. As there was surplus when the agricultural revolution started and they started having surplus, then they needed some full-time merchants, and that's how these merchants began to live in those towns. So you're going to you're going to study all about them, and then you are going to also look at what problems existed in those towns. What were the problems of city life? Not very different from the problems of city life that we have today. Something that I wanted you to notice is the towns in the Middle Ages were called burgs, because usually the towns were surrounded by a fortified wall, and because they were fortified, they were called burgs. So the people who lived in the burg were called the burghers, and that's, as you can imagine, that's the origin of our hamburgers, because hamburgers are the people who live in the town called Hamburg, and they happen to be called hamburgers. So that's basically the summary of this lesson. So by the time you finish looking at all the different aspects of the lesson, you should have very clear who are the members of the nobility, who are the peasants, and who are the burghers, and how each of these groups, how they live, how they work, how they spend their time, and what problems they have, if they have problems. And so the last thing that this lesson has, and that I think is really important, is what is the life of, what is the concept that people have of women. So don't forget that the life of women is important, but not only the life of women, but how men, especially educated men, thought of women. And so that's the last thing that I would like for you to look at before we close the lesson. So this is the end of the introduction to the lesson, and now I hope now you just have all the energy and enthusiasm and go and prepare the lesson, and once you master it, start taking your quizzes, and good luck.